The focus has to be on what produces excellence. The problem with morality, in other words, is that what it gives us is a leveling device. The problem with imposing the same rules on everyone is not just that it's unfair to some, Nietzsche wouldn't make much of that as such, but rather what it does is it lops off the tops, the peaks of excellence, and instead puts all its emphasis on the ordinary. To put this in one way, in Jane Austen, there is always one character. I'm thinking of Mr. Collins in Sense and Sensibility in particular. But he's a character who is very moral. And what's more, he is very reflectively, articulately moral. And everything he does for a reason. And the reason is a moral reason. And the moral reason typically takes the form of something like what Kant called a moral law. Unfortunately, while he obeys these laws, he's a complete bore. Inevitably, he is someone whom the heroine just wants to get rid of and certainly not marry. The problem is that if you follow this notion of morality, as you find it in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as you find it in Kant in particular, it is possible to be a good person, and I want to emphasize that banal phrase, a good person, just by not doing anything wrong. When you think about Christian confession, the question is not, what have you done that's wonderful this week? The question is, what have you done that's evil? What sins have you committed? And the sort of, I suppose, A+ in a confessional would be if you could go in and say, absolutely nothing. Of course, that might be a sin in itself because it represents some sort of pride, but never mind. The idea is that not doing anything wrong is what makes you a good person. And Nietzsche says, this is a good definition of the sickly. You could go through life and never do anything wrong. And one can imagine someone on his or her deathbed thinking, as Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich does on his deathbed, I don't understand. I did everything right. I didn't do anything wrong. And yet, why does it all feel so empty? Because the truth is, being a good person and leading a good life in just those terms really doesn't amount to living a life at all. Kierkegaard reserves the special word existence, from which we get the term existentialism, for just this notion of a life, underscored, italicized, and so on. It is the idea of vibrancy. It's the idea of an adventure. It's the idea of living with passion and devotion and commitment. And for Nietzsche, too, the ideal should not be just being a moral person, obeying these rules, not breaking these commandments. But the ideal is to really live. How should we understand this? Well, let me give you an analogy which I've been hinting towards for quite a few lectures. I think it's an important one, and precisely because it puts Nietzsche not so much on the outside of the entire Western tradition as some sort of grandstanding heckler, but rather brings him right back into the tradition, which I think is where he belongs. Very often, modern philosophy thinks of ethics in two basic flavors. There's the flavor that comes with Kant and this whole emphasis on rational principles, and there's the flavor that comes with John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism and this emphasis on the general good. Looking at it from some distance, you might say, they're really the same. I mean, the principles are different and the considerations are different. One focuses on the intentions with which one acts. The other focuses on the consequences of action. But the truth is they're both involved with rational principles. Categorical imperative or some variation of that on the one hand, and the principle of utility or some variation of that on the other. But it's still, in a way, two peas in a pod. There's an alternative. There's a different way of thinking about ethics, which doesn't come from some foreign source, although I would mark Confucius as one such advocate, but rather straight at the bottom of the Western tradition, and that is from the Greeks. pagan morality. And you might say morality with a small m, because it's one kind of morality. There are others. As opposed to what is called morality with a capital M, what we take to be the only form of morality, which in fact turns out to be just another morality with a small m, the morality of a particular culture, of a particular tradition. And the contrast is dramatic. Although, again, the sort of person who would be heavily praised in, say, Aristotle's time might be very much like the person who was heavily praised in Kant's or Nietzsche's time. But, again, the basis on which they would be praised tends to be very different. Because Kant's sense of morality puts so much emphasis on not doing what's wrong, in other words, coming up to a certain moral standard, there's a real problem trying to understand people who excel, people who are so far above that. In fact, Jesus himself presents Kant with a moral problem, because with Jesus, there is no battle, as there is in all of us, between what you ought to do and your personal desires. The sort of story of the temptation of Christ sort of in a way spells this out. That what we get is a picture of a person who is so perfect that these things aren't at war with one another. And if you take the idealized vision of Christ, which Kant certainly accepted, then there's a question of how does he rate morally? To say that he's a good person just seems kind of limp. It doesn't capture it. What do we do with people who are saints? Or differently, what do we do with people who are heroes? They might not fit the category of being a good person. Nevertheless, they very clearly deserve some kind of moral status. So Kant gives us the term, their behavior is supererogatory. I suppose we might say above and beyond the call of duty. And that's a nice category. But isn't it strange that it's a secondary category, a kind of add-on? What if a morality were to be considered primarily in terms of such notions? And that's what we get from the Greeks. The comparison with Aristotle here is one that Nietzsche himself did not make, and it's interesting to speculate why. I would say the primary reason, now in the realm of morality, is not so much that Aristotle was linked up with Plato and Socrates, whom Nietzsche said are decadent. Aristotle's a decadent too. But rather because, as Nietzsche knew Aristotle, he was probably up in particular with Christianity, and with Thomas Aquinas, even more particularly. Aquinas basically Aquinas virtually took Aristotle's ethical philosophy, and much else besides, and brought it into the Christian religion. And so my guess is that when Nietzsche thought about Aristotle's ethics, what he thought of was primarily this association. In any case, he doesn't seem to pay any attention to it. But, as Nietzsche himself says, what Aristotle does give us is a set of virtues, a set of values, which are probably pretty accurate as a description, maybe not of the way Greece was in Aristotle's time, but at least the ideals that the Greeks of Aristotle's time thought were most important. It may have been that the instantiation, the realization of those ideals, came a generation or so earlier. But nevertheless, it gives us a picture of morality which is very different from the picture we get, for example, from Kant or from John Stuart Mill. The basic notion is the notion of excellence. Whereas you think about Kant in terms of a kind of reciprocity, Kant's often interpreted in terms of the golden rule, sort of formalized in a very fancy way. Always think in terms of what you'd like to have done to you to think about how you should treat other people. Or the vulgar ethics of the English utilitarians. Think about what this does for the general good. What the Greeks suggested, and Aristotle is most articulate on this, is that what ethics consists of are excellences. The Greek word arete can be translated one of two ways. In English translations of the ethics, it's typically translated as virtue. But a more accurate translation, I understand from my classics friends, is really the word excellence. So to think in terms of virtues is to think in what terms people can be excellent. Not just good, but excellent. And to be excellent is not just to obey the rules. It's not just not to do what's wrong. But to be excellent is to be exceptional. It's to be the best. And it's very clear in Nietzsche's conception of the Greeks and in Aristotle's description of his own generation that what you get is a whole series of descriptions of the ideally good, or what Aristotle calls the great-souled man. This is the ideal, to be exceptional, not to be like everyone else, and hopefully to be a good person along with them. Kant's ideal. This notion of the virtues has many virtues itself. For one thing, it is, as Nietzsche would be the first to insist, individual. Even if, as in Aristotle, the virtues are defined in terms of their place in a very particular culture or society. The virtues are individual, and what they represent is something natural. In fact, Aristotle's whole philosophy is a philosophy in which the way of thinking about human beings and human behavior is to think of them as natural, to think of them as quasi-biological, and his leading question is, what is the nature of man? What is the function? What is her place in nature? And to think that way, of course, is just what Nietzsche is advocating by naturalism. One of my old teachers once said to me, this is of course in Aristotle, that the only two thinkers he knows in the history of philosophy who were so wedded to biology and ethics together were Aristotle and Nietzsche. And it was a comment that stuck with me ever since. Because what you get is exactly the picture of an ethics of excellence that Nietzsche really wants. And it's right in the middle of the Western tradition. One of the virtues of all this is the idea of a virtue smashes through that distinction that we discussed earlier between selfish actions on the one hand, or self-interested actions, and doing what you ought to do, doing the right thing on the other. Because if you have a virtue, say honesty, what Aristotle would say is that is exemplified by the fact that you, if you're honest, perform it quite naturally and gladly. In fact, the test of having a virtue is that you enjoy doing it. So instead of just going down on selfishness and saying selfishness is bad, Nietzsche comes back with a question which basically goes, it's not a question of egoism, it's a question of whose ego? What virtues does it manifest? And with regard to love, which we talked about several lectures ago, the question is not just, is it love? But the question is, whose love? Is this a love which enhances excellence? Or is it a love which is simply basic security?